They say you can never truly know another person, but that is a lie that lazy people tell themselves. I spent 40 years standing at the front of a classroom in this town, and I assure you that I know exactly who these people are. I know who cheated on their algebra final in 1988, and I know who stole the lunch money in 92, and I know who is capable of lying to a sheriff's face without blinking. The town sees Mayor Conrad Pyle as a hero and a pillar of the community. But when I look at him, I still see the boy who sat in the third row and thought he was smarter than the rules. He thinks he buried his secrets deep enough that the rot wouldn't smell, but he forgot one thing. I never throw away a gradebook, and today is the day I open it back up to give him one final failing grade. The heat in Georgia during mid-July is not just a weather condition, it is a physical weight that sits on your chest and demands that you move slowly. It was a Saturday morning, and the air was thick with the smell of wet asphalt and blooming magnolias and the sweat of 300 people gathered in the town square. I stood near the back of the crowd under the shade of an old oak tree because at 74 years old, I have earned the right to avoid the direct sun. I adjusted the brim of my straw hat and watched them all. To anyone else, this was just a crowd of adults celebrating the town centennial. But to me, it was a sea of former children. I saw the doctor who used to eat paste, and I saw the bank manager who used to cry when called upon to read aloud, and I saw the sheriff who I once suspended for fighting behind the gymnasium. They were all grown up now, with graying hair and mortgages and secrets, but to me they would always be the teenagers who sat in my history class and tried to hide things from me. The center of attention today was the mayor. Conrad Pyle stood on the wooden gazebo stage, wiping his forehead with a crisp white handkerchief. He was 52 now, but he still had that same polished charm that had let him slide through high school without ever doing a real day of work. He wore a navy blue suit that cost more than my car, and he flashed that bright white smile that made the women in the front row fan themselves a little harder. He was speaking into the microphone about legacy and history and the importance of remembering where we came from. I listened to his voice and felt a familiar irritation rising in my gut. It was the same feeling I used to get when he would turn in an essay that I knew he hadn't written. Conrad was a smooth talker. He could sell ice to a drowning man and make him thank him for the chill. The event today was the unearthing of the centennial time capsule. It was a large iron trunk that had been buried by the senior class of 1992 exactly 30 years ago. The town had been buzzing about it for weeks. People love nostalgia because it lets them remember a version of the past that never actually existed. They wanted to see the mixtapes and the old newspapers and the letters they had written to their future selves. 2 city workers in neon vests were digging in the center of the square. The sound of metal shovels hitting the earth was rhythmic and heavy. The crowd hushed as the trunk was hoisted up from the hole. It was rusted and covered in red Georgia clay, but it was intact. Conrad stepped forward and clapped his hands together. He made a joke about hoping his old hair gel hadn't exploded inside, and the crowd laughed. It was an easy, practiced laugh. They loved him. They voted for him 3 times in a row because he told them what they wanted to hear. The workers popped the latches with a crowbar. The lid creaked open, and a smell of stale air and old paper wafted out. Conrad began to pull items out one by one, holding them up like prizes. There was a Nirvana cassette tape. There was a signed football from the state championship game. There was a denim jacket with patches on the back. When Conrad pulled out the jacket, the crowd cheered. It was a relic of the 90s, acid-washed and oversized. Conrad held it up and smiled. "I remember this jacket," he said, his voice booming over the speakers. "I remember putting this in here myself. I tucked it right next to the football. It belonged to our dear friend Sarah, who left us too soon to chase her dreams in Hollywood. We all miss her, don't we, folks?" A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. Sarah Miller, the girl who ran away 3 days after graduation in '92 and never called home. The town tragedy. Conrad hugged the jacket to his chest for a moment, looking somber. It was a perfect performance, a moment of silence for the lost girl. But I was not looking at the jacket. I was looking at Conrad's hands. I saw a slight tremor in his fingers. I saw the way his eyes darted to the sheriff standing by the stage. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of fear that lasted less than a second, but I saw it. And then my mind clicked back. Not to the present, but to 1992. I have a memory like a steel trap. It is a blessing and a curse. I remembered that day in May, when the capsule was buried. It was a Tuesday. We had an assembly. I narrowed my eyes and looked at the mayor. He was lying. He claimed he put that jacket in the trunk. He claimed he stood there with the rest of the student council and sealed it up. But Conrad Pyle wasn't at school that Tuesday. I felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning I was missing. I remembered clearly because that was the week of final exams. Conrad had missed his history final that morning. He had brought me a note the next day from his father, claiming he had been at a dentist appointment in Atlanta. If he was in Atlanta at the dentist, how could he have placed the jacket in the capsule? I watched him place the jacket back on the table. He was sweating more profusely now. He looked eager to move on to the next item to distract the crowd with a funny yearbook photo or a preserved menu from the old diner. Something was wrong. Sarah Miller didn't run away without her favorite jacket. She wore that jacket every single day. It was her armor. She wouldn't have left it behind in a box to be buried for 30 years unless she didn't need it anymore. Unless she couldn't need it anymore. The ceremony dragged on for another hour, but I stopped listening. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I turned away from the stage and began to walk back toward my car. My hip ached with every step, but I ignored it. I needed to get home. I lived in a small Victorian house on Elm Street that was filled with books and dust and silence. I walked through the front door and didn't even stop to take off my hat. I went straight to the hallway closet and pulled down the ladder to the attic. The air in the attic was stiflingly hot, but I didn't care. I navigated through the stacks of old magazines and holiday decorations until I found the plastic bins labeled by decade. I pulled out the bin marked 90s. Inside were stack after stack of red spiral-bound notebooks. My gradebooks. I never threw them away. I kept them all because I believed that history was important, and these books were the history of this town. I found the book for the 1991 to 1992 school year. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened the cover. I flipped past the fall semester. I flipped past the winter break. I found the page for May. I ran my finger down the list of names until I found it. Pyle, Conrad. There it was, written in my own sharp cursive ink. May 12th, 1992. The day of the time capsule burial. Next to his name was a red A. Absent, and next to Sarah Miller's name on the same date was also a red A. Conrad had lied to the whole town just now. He wasn't at the burial. He wasn't at the dentist. And Sarah didn't leave for Hollywood that week. They were both missing on the same day, and only one of them came back. I closed the book and felt the heavy weight of the truth settling on my shoulders. The police had closed Sarah's case as a runaway because she left a note. A note that was typed, not handwritten. A note that appeared 3 days later. I looked down at the red letter A in my gradebook. It looked like a scar on the paper. Conrad Pyle thought he was the mayor. He thought he was untouchable. But he was just a student who had skipped class, and he was about to learn that I did not tolerate truancy. I picked up the gradebook and carried it downstairs. I needed tea. And then I needed to make a plan. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of Earl Grey tea that had gone cold hours ago. The house was silent in the way that only a house lived in by one person can be silent. It was a heavy stillness that amplified the scratching sound of the crickets outside and the humming of the refrigerator in the corner. But the loudest thing in the room was the red spiral notebook lying open on the lace tablecloth. I stared at that red letter A next to Conrad Pyle's name. It was just a single letter, written in ballpoint pen 30 years ago. But to me, it looked like a neon sign pointing directly at a crime. I have always told my students that the devil is in the details, and most people go through life without ever looking closely at anything. They see what they want to see. They see a charming mayor giving a speech about a denim jacket. I see a timeline that does not overlap. I needed more than just the attendance record. A gradebook tells you that a student was absent, but it does not tell you why. For that, I needed the excuse notes. Most teachers throw those scraps of paper away at the end of the semester, but I am not most teachers. I am a historian of this town's youth. I kept every forged signature and every doctor's note and every tear-stained letter from a parent begging for an extension. I pushed myself up from the table and my knees popped in protest. I walked back to the hallway closet where I kept the filing boxes. The cedar smell of the closet hit me as I pulled down the heavy cardboard box labeled Spring 1992, Administrative. I carried it to the living room rug and sat down on the floor. It was undignified for a woman of my age to be sitting on the carpet surrounded by dusty papers, but I didn't care. I began to sort through the files. I was looking for the folder marked May. My hands were steady as I flipped through the papers. I saw notes from mothers claiming their sons had the flu when I knew for a fact they had gone fishing. I saw notes about grandmothers dying for the third time in 1 year. And then I found it. It was a piece of creamy white paper folded in thirds. It stood out because it wasn't written on a napkin or a piece of torn notebook paper. It was written on official stationery from the county sheriff's office. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the ink was still dark. Please excuse Conrad from classes on May 12th. He has an emergency dental procedure in Atlanta, Mta. Deputy Pyle? I read it twice. Deputy Pyle. Conrad's father. The man who eventually became sheriff and then retired to a lake house paid for by taxpayers. I looked at the time stamp on the bottom of the note. It said he was picked up at 10 o'clock a.m. Atlanta is a 2-hour drive from here. If he had a dental emergency, he would have been in the chair by noon. The time capsule ceremony in 1992 took place at 2 o'clock p.m. behind the gymnasium. I closed my eyes and let my mind reconstruct the day. I remembered the ceremony. I remembered the heat. I remembered the principal giving a speech. I scanned the faces in my memory. The entire student council was there standing in a line. Conrad was the vice president that year. If he had been there standing next to the capsule, I would have marked him present. I would have seen him. But he wasn't there. So why did he stand on that stage today and tell 300 people that he placed that jacket in the trunk with his own hands? He lied today to make himself part of the story, to look like a grieving friend. But the lie he told 30 years ago was the dangerous one. I looked at the excuse note again. Emergency dental procedure. I reached for the magnifying glass I keep on the side table for reading the fine print in the newspaper. I held it over the note. I looked at the signature. Deputy Pyle. The loop on the P was too round. The slant of the letters leaned to the left. I knew Deputy Pyle's signature. I had seen it on ticket citations and permission slips for years. His handwriting was jagged and sharp like barbed wire. This signature was soft. It was careful. It was a forgery. Conrad had written this note himself. He had stolen a piece of his father's stationery and forged his father's signature to get out of school. My heart began to beat faster. Why would a 17-year-old boy go to such lengths to skip school on the day of the biggest event of the year? He wasn't skipping to go fishing. He wasn't skipping to play video games. He was skipping to be with someone. I looked back at the gradebook. Sarah Miller, absent, unexcused. The police report said Sarah ran away on May 15th. That was 3 days after the capsule was buried, but my book showed she was absent on the 12th, and the 13th, and the 14th. She didn't run away on the 15th. She was already gone on the 12th. The pieces were starting to click together in my mind, like the gears of a clock. Conrad and Sarah were both missing on the same day. Conrad forged a note to cover his tracks. Sarah just vanished, and today, 30 years later, Conrad pulls her jacket out of a box he wasn't even present to close. He had the jacket. He had it on the day she disappeared, and he needed a way to get rid of it. He couldn't burn it because someone might smell the smoke. He couldn't throw it in the river because it might float. So he put it in the one place where he knew no one would look for exactly 30 years. He put it in the time capsule, but he couldn't have put it in during the ceremony because he wasn't there. He must have snuck back later, maybe that night, maybe under the cover of darkness with a shovel in his hand. He dug it up and slipped the jacket inside and buried it again before anyone noticed. I felt a chill that went deep into my bones. I was sitting in my living room holding a piece of paper that proved the mayor was a liar and a forger, and possibly something much worse. I looked out the window. The streetlights had flickered on. The town looked peaceful and sleepy, but I knew better. This town was good at hiding things. It hid secrets behind manicured hedges and polite smiles. I needed to be sure. I couldn't go to the sheriff with a hunch and a forged dental note. The current sheriff was Conrad's cousin. They would laugh me out of the office, or worse, they would make the evidence disappear. I needed to prove that the dental appointment never happened. I stood up and brushed the dust from my skirt. I walked over to the bookshelf and pulled down the thick yellow phone book from '92. I keep everything. People think I am a hoarder, but I am simply prepared. I flipped to the section for Atlanta. I ran my finger down the list of dentists. There were hundreds of them. But the note didn't specify a doctor. It just said Atlanta. That was a mistake. A real parent would have written the doctor's name in case the school needed to call. Dr. Smith or Dr. Jones. But Conrad just wrote Atlanta. It was vague. It was the lie of a teenager who didn't think the teacher would check. He underestimated me then, and he was underestimating me now. I went to my desk and pulled out a fresh red pen. I opened a new notebook. I wrote Conrad Pyle at the top of the page. And then I wrote step 1, the alibi. I was going to the library tomorrow. I needed to see the local newspapers from that week. I needed to see if anyone reported seeing a mayor's son and a quiet girl driving out of town in a blue Ford Mustang on the morning of May 12th. I turned off the kitchen light. I wasn't afraid. I had spent 40 years dealing with bullies and liars. Conrad Pyle might be the mayor now, but in my classroom, he was still just a boy who hadn't done his homework. And I was about to give him a failing grade that would stick for the rest of his life. I have always believed that a library is the only true church in a town like this. It is a place where the truth sits quietly on a shelf waiting for someone brave enough to pull it down. The sun was already beating down on the asphalt when I backed my Buick out of the driveway. The car is 20 years old and smells like peppermint and old upholstery, but it runs with a reliability that most modern machines lack. I drove slowly down Elm Street, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror. I am not a paranoid woman by nature. I do not jump at shadows or believe in ghosts.
but I know how small towns work. I know that when you start poking at a loose thread, the whole sweater starts to unravel, and people get nervous. A black sedan turned onto the street behind me. It hung back about 3 car lengths, maintaining a steady distance. I didn't recognize the car. It had tinted windows, which was unusual for folks around here who generally like to wave at their neighbors to see who is riding shotgun. I made a right turn onto Main Street without signaling, just to see what it would do. The sedan followed. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Conrad Pyle moved fast. I had only been at the ceremony yesterday, but perhaps my lack of applause had been noted, or perhaps he simply remembered that I was the one person in this town who had never bought into his charming smile. I pulled into the library parking lot, and the sedan continued past, slowing down just enough for the driver to look at my car before accelerating away. I memorized the first 3 digits of the license plate. I would write them down later in my notebook. The library was a brick building that used to be the post office before the war. It was cool inside and smelled of floor wax and decaying paper. I walked past the front desk, where the new young librarian was scrolling on her phone, and headed straight for the reference section in the back. The microfilm machines were tucked away in a dark corner, like shameful secrets. They were ancient, bulky contraptions that whirred and groaned when you turned the crank. I sat down and loaded the reel for the Gazette, dated May 1992. The screen flickered to life, casting a bluish-white glow on my face. I began to scroll. I watched the days of that long-ago spring fly past in a blur of black and white headlines. The high school baseball scores, the advertisements for grocery specials, the obituaries of people who were now just names on stones. I stopped at May 15, 1992. The headline was small, buried on page 4. Local teen reported missing. I read the article. It was brief. It stated that Sarah Miller, age 17, had not been seen since Tuesday, May 12th. It said her parents had filed a report after she failed to return home from school. It mentioned that a note had been found in her locker stating she was leaving to pursue an acting career in California. There was no mention of the time capsule, no mention of the jacket. I leaned closer to the screen. The article ended with a standard line. Anyone with information is asked to contact Deputy Sheriff Pyle at the county office. I sat back and felt the cold plastic of the chair against my spine. Deputy Pyle. Conrad's father had taken the report. He had controlled the narrative from the very first moment. A shadow fell across my table. I didn't jump. I simply turned my head slowly. Elias Thorne was standing there. He was a tall, thin man with stooped shoulders and skin the color of old parchment. He was the head archivist, and he had been working in this library since before I started teaching. He was a quiet man who lived alone, and people in town generally ignored him because he didn't play golf, and he didn't go to the Baptist church. "Hello, Sylvia," he said softly. His voice sounded unused, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "Hello, Elias," I replied. I turned back to the screen. I assumed he was just doing his rounds. "You are looking at the Miller girl," he said. It wasn't a question. I paused my hand, hovering over the crank. I looked at him again. His eyes behind his thick glasses were sharp and intelligent. "I am," I said. "Is there a rule against reminiscing?" Elias pulled out the chair next to me and sat down. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his hands, which were folded on the table. "Conrad Pyle was here this morning," he said. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face impassive. Was he now? "He came in right when we opened." Elias continued. "He wanted to know if we had digital copies of the newspapers from 1992. He asked if we could remove some of the old physical archives. He said they were a fire hazard." I felt a surge of anger so hot it almost made me dizzy. Conrad was trying to erase history. He was trying to burn the books before anyone could read them. "What did you tell him?" I asked. Elias smiled, and it was a small, dry thing. I told him that the archives are state property and cannot be destroyed without a court order. He was not pleased. He mentioned that the library budget is up for review next month. Elias looked up and met my eyes. We stared at
each other for a long moment. In that silence, I realized that Elias Thorne was not just a librarian. He was a guardian. He knew exactly who Conrad Pyle was. He had probably watched Conrad bully the other children in the children's section 30 years ago. He knew the bullies always grew up to be politicians. "He is afraid?" Sylvia Elias whispered. "I have never seen him afraid before. He should be afraid," I said. I looked back at the blue screen. The police report mentioned a note found in her locker. "Do you remember that note, Elias?" "I remember what the paper said," Elias replied. "They said it was typed. They said it was unsigned, but they assumed it was her because it was in her locker. A typed note in 1992. Sarah Miller didn't own a typewriter. Most students handwrote everything, and if you are running away to be an actress, you want your parents to know it is you. You sign your name. You leave a trace of yourself. A typed note is the coward's way of putting words in a dead girl's mouth." Elias reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small brass key. He slid it across the table toward me. "What is this?" I asked. "It is the key to the basement storage room," Elias said. "We keep the hard copies of the police blotters down there. The newspapers only print what they are told. The police blotters list every call that came in, every dispatch, every arrest, even the ones that didn't make the paper." I looked at the key. It was heavy and cold. "Why are you giving me this, Elias?" "Because I remember Sarah Miller," he said softly. "She used to come in here every afternoon to read. She liked poetry. She was a kind girl. And I remember Conrad Pyle coming in here and tearing pages out of encyclopedias just because he could." He stood up and pushed his chair back. "I am going to take my lunch break now," he said. "The basement is restricted. If anyone finds you down there, I will have to say you stole the key." "I understand," I said. "Good luck, Sylvia." He walked away, his shoes making no sound on the carpet. I waited until he was gone, and then I snatched the key off the table. I made my way to the door marked "Staff Only" near the back. I slipped the key into the lock, and it turned with a satisfying click. I stepped into the darkness and smelled the scent of damp concrete and dust. I found the light switch, and a single bulb flickered overhead, illuminating rows of metal shelving stacked with cardboard boxes. I walked down the aisle, scanning the dates written in marker on the side. I pulled the box down. My hands were trembling now, not from age, but from adrenaline. I opened the lid. Inside were stacks of carbon copy forms, the pink and yellow sheets that the police used to use. I flipped through May, drunk and disorderly, speeding ticket, domestic disturbance. And then I found May 12th. There was no report for Sarah Miller. I flipped to the 13th. Nothing. I flipped to the 14th. Nothing. I flipped to the 15th. There it was. Missing person report. Filed by parents. Taken by Deputy Pyle. But then I saw something else. A sheet of paper stapled to the back of the report. It was a handwritten note from a different officer. A deputy named Miller. No relation to Sarah. The note was scrawled in hasty handwriting. Caller reported seeing blue Ford Mustang near the old quarry on May 12th. Driver identified as male teen. Passenger identified as female teen. Dispatched to investigate. And underneath that, in different handwriting, the sharp, jagged handwriting of Deputy Pyle, was a single word: unfounded.
Pyle had intercepted the call. Another officer had taken a call about a witness seeing them at the quarry on the day they went missing. Pyle had taken over the investigation and marked it as unfounded without ever filing an official report. He had buried the witness sighting, just like his son had buried the jacket. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the document. The flash seemed incredibly bright in the dim basement. I had the timeline. I had the forgery. And now I had the cover-up. I put the paper back in the box and closed the lid. I needed to get out of here. I needed to find out who that other deputy was. Deputy Miller. If he was still alive, he was the loose end that Conrad had forgotten to cut. I climbed the stairs and locked the door behind me. I left the key on the reference table where Elias would find it. I walked out into the blinding sunlight. The black sedan was parked across the street. The window rolled down just an inch. I stared directly at it. I wanted them to know I saw them. I wanted Conrad to know that the teacher was watching and the lesson was just beginning. I got into my Buick and started the engine. Next stop, the quarry. Or maybe the nursing home. I needed to find out what happened to Deputy Miller. The best place to hide a knife is inside a bouquet of flowers. I learned that strategy not from a military manual, but from the mothers of the PTA who could destroy a reputation while passing a plate of deviled eggs. If I wanted to get close to Conrad Pyle, I could not storm into his office like a prosecutor. I had to walk in like a grandmother. I stood in my kitchen and wrapped a jar of my spiced peach preserves in a blue ribbon. It was a batch I had canned 2 summers ago, and the sugar had crystallized slightly at the bottom, but it looked charming enough. I put on my Sunday cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons, and applied a shade of lipstick that was soft and pink. I looked harmless. I looked fragile. I looked exactly like the kind of old woman who forgets where she parked her car. City Hall sits in the center of the square directly across from the hole where the time capsule had been. The building was renovated 5 years ago with taxpayer money, and now it looks more like a bank than a seat of government. The floors are marble, and the air conditioning is set so low that it makes your skin prickle. I walked past the security guard who barely looked up from his phone. I took the elevator to the 3rd floor where the mayor's office occupied the corner suite. The reception area was sleek and modern with uncomfortable chairs and a receptionist who looked like she was 12 years old. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses and asked if I had an appointment. I smiled my sweetest smile and set the jar of jam on her desk. "I don't need an appointment to see one of my favorite students," I said. "I just wanted to bring Conrad a little treat to congratulate him on the ceremony yesterday." "I am Mrs. Crowe." The girl hesitated. She knew the name. Everyone in this town knew the name Mrs. Crowe. It carried a weight that bureaucracy could not ignore. She picked up the phone and whispered into it. A moment later, the heavy oak doors opened and Conrad Pyle stepped out. He was in his shirt sleeves, his tie loosened slightly. When he saw me, his face arranged itself into a mask of delighted surprise. He walked over with his arms wide open and hugged me. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale coffee. "Mrs. Crowe," he boomed, his voice filling the room. "What an honor! To what do I owe the pleasure?" I patted his arm and held up the jam. "I just wanted to say how proud I was of your speech yesterday, Conrad. It was very moving." He beamed. He took the jar and ushered me into his office, closing the door behind us. The office was expansive, with windows overlooking the town square. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk and gestured for me to take the leather chair opposite him. "It is always good to see you," he said, leaning back. "You look wonderful. Retirement treats you well." I settled into the chair and clutched my purse in my lap. "I try to keep busy," I said. "In fact, I was doing a little spring cleaning in the attic yesterday. I found some of my old gradebooks." Conrad's smile didn't falter, but his eyes went still. He stopped rocking in his chair. "Is that so?" he said. "You always were meticulous with your records, Mrs. Crowe." I nodded. I was reading through the spring of 1992. It brought back so many memories. I was so confused, though, Conrad, because I could have sworn you said yesterday that you put that jacket in the time capsule yourself. I watched him carefully. He picked up a silver pen and began to twirl it between his fingers. "I did put it in there," he said, his voice smooth. "Why would you be confused?" "Well," I said, leaning forward slightly, "my gradebook says you were absent that day, and I found the excuse note from your father. It said you were in Atlanta for an emergency dental procedure." The pen stopped twirling. The room went very quiet. The hum of the computer fan seemed to roar in my ears. Conrad looked at me, and for the first time since he was 17, I saw the boy who knew he was caught. But then the politician took over. He let out a short laugh. "Oh, Mrs. Crowe," he said, shaking his head. "You know how memory is. It was 30 years ago. I probably put the jacket in the box the day before the ceremony. Or maybe I gave it to the principal to put in for me. The details get fuzzy." I smiled again, but I let the warmth drop out of it. "It is funny how details work," I said. "Like how you had a dental emergency on the exact same day Sarah Miller disappeared, and how her jacket ended up in a box that was sealed while you were supposedly in a dentist chair 2 hours away. It is quite a coincidence." Conrad placed the pen down on the desk. The sound of metal hitting wood was sharp. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany. The charm was gone. His face was hard and cold. "Mrs. Crowe," he said softly, "I think you are confused, and I think you should be careful. Confusion is a common symptom at your age. People start to imagine things. They start to see connections that aren't there. I am not senile. Conrad," I said, my voice steady, "and I know a forged signature when I see one." He stood up. He walked over to the window and looked out at the town. He kept his back to me. "You know, Sylvia," he said, using my first name, which was a deliberate disrespect, "this town takes care of its own. We protect our history. We don't like it when people try to rewrite it with dirty rumors." He turned back to face me. The sun was behind him, casting his face in shadow. "I would hate for you to tarnish your legacy," he continued. "You have a nice life, a nice pension, a nice house on Elm Street. It would be a shame if city inspectors found code violations in that old Victorian structure, or if there were clerical errors with your retirement benefits. Bureaucracy can be so messy." The threat hung in the air like smoke. He was threatening my home. He was threatening my survival. I stood up slowly. My knees were shaking, but I locked them straight. "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Mayor," I said. He smiled again, but it was a shark smile. "Good. I am glad we had this little chat, and thank you for the jam." I walked to the door. My hand was on the knob when I turned back. "By the way, Conrad," I said, "I hope your teeth are better. I hear rot can spread if you don't cut it out." I walked out of the office and past the receptionist. I didn't breathe until I was in the elevator, and the doors slid shut. I leaned against the metal wall and closed my eyes. He was scared. He had threatened me, which meant I was right. He had confirmed everything without saying a word. But he had also drawn a line in the sand. He was willing to use his power to hurt me. He was willing to take my home and my money to keep his secret. I walked out of City Hall and into the blinding heat. I looked at my car parked on the street. I needed to go to the nursing home. I needed to find Deputy Miller, assuming he was still alive. Conrad thought he could scare me into silence. He forgot that I had handled bullies bigger and meaner than him. I got into my car and locked the doors. I checked the rearview mirror. The black sedan was there again, parked 2 rows back. Let them follow me. I knew where I was going. The night has a way of amplifying sound. When you live alone, every creak of the floorboards sounds like a footstep, and every branch tapping against the window sounds like a knuckle rapping on glass. I went to bed early that night after double locking the front door and propping a heavy dining room chair under the handle of the back door. I am not paranoid, but I am prudent. Conrad Pyle had looked at me with eyes that were cold and dead, and I knew that men like him do not like loose ends. I slept fitfully. My dreams were a disjointed mix of the past and the present. I saw Sarah Miller laughing in the hallway in 1992. And then I saw her face fade into the static of a microfilm screen. I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound that made my blood freeze. It was a tearing sound, a wet, crunching noise coming from the side yard. I sat up in bed and reached for the phone on my nightstand. My finger hovered over the keypad. If I called 911, who would come? Deputy Pyle's old friends. The men who owed their jobs to the mayor's budget approval. I realized with a sinking feeling that calling the police might be the same as inviting the fox into the henhouse. The noise continued. It sounded like a wild animal thrashing through the brush. But we don't have bears in the city limits, and deer are too graceful to make such a racket. This was heavy. This was deliberate. I did not go outside. I am 74 years old, and I have a bad hip. I am not going to confront an intruder in the dark in my nightgown. That is how old women die in movies, and I have no intention of becoming a cautionary tale. I turned off the lamp so I wouldn't be a silhouette, and I moved to the window. I peeked through the slats of the blinds. It was pitch black outside. The street lamp that usually illuminates my driveway was out. Convenient. I saw a shadow moving near the trellis. It was large and bulky. It raised a heavy object, a bat or a shovel, and brought it down hard. Thwack! I flinched. The figure turned and ran toward the street. I heard a car door slam and an engine roar to life. No headlights. The car sped away into the darkness. I sat in the rocking chair by the window and waited for the sun to come up. I didn't sleep again. I sat there with my anger keeping me warm. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, I put on my robe and my garden clogs and went outside to survey the damage. I expected a broken window or maybe spray paint on the siding. What I found was much worse. My rose garden was destroyed. I have been cultivating these roses for 20 years. They were Grand Flora's prize winners with blooms the size of saucers. They were my pride. I spent hours every week pruning and feeding and deadheading them. They were living things that I had nurtured from bare roots into magnificence. Now they were mulch. Every single bush had been hacked to pieces. The blooms were trampled into the mud. The trellis was splintered. The air smelled of crushed petals and raw sap. A green, sharp scent that smelled like a wound. I stood there and felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. It was such a senseless, violent act. It wasn't just vandalism. It was an execution. It was a message. Look what we can do to the things you love. I took a deep breath and forced the tears back. Crying would not fix the roses, and it certainly wouldn't scare Conrad Pyle. I walked into the mess of mud and petals. I looked down at the ground. The soil was soft from the rain 2 days ago. There in the center of the bed, right on top of a crushed yellow rose, was a footprint. It was deep and clear. A heavy boot print with a distinct lug sole pattern. I leaned down and studied it. It was massive. I went back inside and got my sewing tape measure and my camera. I took photos of the destruction from every angle. Then I placed the tape measure next to the print. 12.5 inches long. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. I closed my eyes and pictured Conrad Pyle in his office yesterday. He was a big man, tall and broad. When he had walked me to the door, I had noticed his shoes. They were expensive Italian loafers, but his feet were large, size 12 at least. This wasn't some neighborhood kid pulling a prank. Kids wear sneakers. This was a man wearing work boots. A man who came prepared to do heavy damage. I looked at the trellis again. A piece of fabric was snagged on a splinter of wood. I pulled it free with a pair of tweezers. It was a tiny scrap of blue denim. I put the fabric in a plastic sandwich bag. Conrad Pyle wanted me to be afraid. He wanted me to see this carnage and think about my own fragile bones. He wanted me to pack my bags and move to a condo in Florida where I would play bingo and forget about 1992. But as I looked at the decapitated stems of my roses, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, hard resolve. He had made a tactical error. He had attacked my garden. He didn't know that you can cut a rose bush down to the ground. But if the roots are strong, it will just grow back with sharper thorns. I went back inside and made a pot of coffee. Strong coffee. I sat at my kitchen table and opened my notebook to a fresh page. Step 2. The witness. I needed to find the man who had written the note on the back of the police report. Deputy Miller. The one who had actually tried to do his job before Conrad's father shut him down. I pulled out the phone book. There were 3 Millers listed in the county. One was a bakery, one was a mechanic, and one was Miller, Thomas. Shady Pines Assisted Living. Thomas Miller. It had to be him. I looked at the clock. It was 7:00 a.m. Visiting hours at the nursing home started at 9. I would leave the roses exactly as they were. Let the neighbors see. Let them ask questions. Let the rumor mill start turning. I went to my closet and pulled out my best navy suit, the one I used to wear for parent-teacher conferences when I had to deliver bad news. Conrad Pyle had started a war. He thought he was fighting a little old lady. He forgot that I was a history teacher, and history is written by the victors. I finished my coffee and checked the battery on my phone. I was going to Shady Pines. And this time, I was going to get the truth on tape. Shady Pines Assisted Living was located on the edge of town, a beige brick building that smelled of lemon polish and boiled cabbage. It was the place where the town parked its elderly when they became too inconvenient to keep at home. I walked through the sliding glass doors, my heels clicking on the linoleum. The receptionist was a young woman with purple fingernails who didn't bother to look up from her magazine. "I'm here to see Thomas Miller," I said, using my classroom voice, the tone that makes students sit up straight. She blinked and pointed down the hall. "Room 304, but he's not having a good day. He's sundowning early." "I am not afraid of the dark," I said, and marched past her. Room 304 was small and dim, the blinds drawn against the morning sun. Thomas Miller sat in a wheelchair facing a television that was playing a game show on mute. He was a shadow of the boy I remembered. Thomas had been a linebacker on the football team, a wall of muscle and noise. Now, he was skeletal, his skin draped over his bones like a shirt 2 sizes too big. "Thomas," I said softly. He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the screen, glazed with the milky film of cataracts and memory loss. I pulled a metal chair next to him and sat down. "Thomas, look at me. It's Mrs. Crowe, history class. 3rd period." He turned his head slowly. A flicker of recognition sparked in his eyes, then faded. "Mrs. Crowe," he rasped. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping together. "Did I fail the test?" "No, Thomas," I said, leaning in close. "But I need you to answer a question for me. A question about 1992. He flinched. His hands,
gnarled with arthritis, gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. 992, he whispered. Bad year. Rain came down hard. May 12th, I pressed. You took a call, Thomas. You wrote a note on the back of a missing person report. You wrote that a witness saw a blue Mustang at the quarry. Thomas began to shake. His breathing hitched. I wrote it down. I did my job. I know you did, I soothed. But who called you, Thomas? Who was the witness? He looked at the door, his eyes wide with a sudden, lucid terror. He told me to burn it. The sheriff. He said it was a mistake. He said if I wanted my pension, I'd forget the call came in. Sheriff Pyle is dead, Thomas. He can't hurt you anymore. His son can, Thomas hissed. He leaned forward, clutching my wrist with surprising strength. The boy is worse. The boy has dead eyes. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Thomas Miller had been living in fear for 30 years. Thomas, please, who called you? I need a name. He looked around the room as if the walls had ears. He pulled me closer, his breath sour. It was the cheerleader, he whispered, the one with the loud laugh. She was crying. She said she was hiking near the ridge. She saw them arguing. Which cheerleader, Thomas? The Kessler girl, he said. Naomi. She saw it. She saw him hit her. Naomi Kessler. The name landed like a stone in my stomach. Naomi Kessler had been the head cheerleader, the homecoming queen runner-up, and the girl who lived in Sarah Miller's shadow. She was loud, popular, and terrified of losing her status. Of course she hadn't come forward. In high school, social standing is a currency more valuable than truth. Thank you, Thomas, I said, patting his hand. You passed the test. I left him staring back at the silent television. I had a name, but finding Naomi Kessler would be harder. She had moved away years ago, married a real estate developer in Charlotte, if the alumni newsletter was correct. I walked out of Shady Pines and into the heat. I needed to find a current address. I reached for my car door handle, and then I froze. Across the street, hanging above the entrance to the VFW hall, was a large vinyl banner fluttering in the breeze. Welcome back, Wildcats! Class of 92, 30th reunion. I stared at the banner. The timing was almost too perfect. Cosmic clockwork finally ticking into place. Tonight. They were all gathering tonight. Conrad Pyle would be there to kiss babies and shake hands. And Naomi Kessler. If she had any nostalgia left in her soul, she would be there too. I looked down at my watch. It was 11 a.m. The reunion started at 7 p.m. I got into my car. The black sedan was nowhere to be seen, likely because they thought an old woman visiting a nursing home was a dead end. They were wrong. I drove home, my mind racing. I couldn't just walk into the reunion. I wasn't invited, and security would be tight with the mayor attending. I needed a way in. I spent the afternoon preparing. I wasn't preparing a lesson plan. I was preparing for an infiltration. I went to my closet and pushed aside the cardigans. I reached into the back, past the sensible wool coats, and pulled out a garment bag. Inside was a black silk dress I hadn't worn since my husband's funeral 10 years ago. It was severe, elegant, and commanded respect. I polished my silver brooch. I pinned my hair up into a tight chignon. At 6:45 p.m., I drove to the VFW hall. The parking lot was already full of luxury SUVs and sedans. I parked my battered Buick right next to a Porsche. There was a table set up at the entrance with two women checking names off a list. I recognized them, Mary Beth and Linda. They used to pass notes in my study hall.
I walked up to the table. I didn't wait for them to ask for my ticket. "Good evening, ladies," I said, projecting my voice just enough to be heard over the DJ music thumping from inside. "I trust you haven't forgotten the dress code policy." Mary Beth's jaw dropped. "Mrs. Crowe, what are you doing here?" "I am here to chaperone," I said smoothly. "I heard there might be alcohol served, and considering how this class behaved in 1992, I thought supervision was required." They were so stunned, so conditioned by years of fearing my detention slip, that they didn't move. They just stared. "Well?" I said, arching an eyebrow. "Are you going to let me in, or do I need to call your mothers?" Linda stammered and stepped aside. Go right in, Mrs. Crowe." I walked past them and into the hall. The room was decorated with gold and black balloons. A disco ball spun overhead. The air smelled of cheap perfume and desperate nostalgia. There were 100 people in the room, holding plastic cups and shouting over Bon Jovi. I scanned the crowd. I saw the doctor. I saw the banker. I saw Conrad Pyle holding court near the bar, laughing at his own joke. And then I saw her, Naomi Kessler. She was standing near the buffet table, looking fragile in a red sequined dress that was trying too hard. She was gripping a glass of white wine like a lifeline. She looked older than 48. Her face was tight with Botox, but her eyes were darting around the room with the same anxiety I remembered from her teenage years. She wasn't looking at her old friends. She was looking at Conrad, and she looked terrified. I adjusted my brooch and began to move through the crowd. I didn't rush. I moved like a glacier, slow, inevitable, and capable of crushing anything in my path. Class was in session. The song changed to "Smells Like Teen Spirit," and the irony was lost on everyone except me. 140-year-olds were jumping up and down, screaming about being entertained, while I navigated the crowd like a shark moving through a school of particularly slow tuna. I kept my eyes locked on Naomi Kessler. She was drinking her wine too fast. I watched her tip the glass back, her throat working convulsively, then immediately signal the bartender for another. She was nervous. She was looking at Conrad Pyle across the room every 30 seconds, like a mouse checking the location of the house cat. I made my move when she turned toward the hallway leading to the restrooms. It was the classic retreat of the overwhelmed high school girl, hiding in the bathroom to fix her makeup and composure. I followed her. The hallway was quieter, the thumping bass of the music muffled by the heavy fire doors. I watched her push into the ladies' room. I waited a count of 5, then followed. The bathroom was tiled in pink and smelled of fake potpourri and bleach. Naomi was standing at the sink, gripping the porcelain with both hands, staring at herself in the mirror. She was hyperventilating, shallow little gasps that fogged the glass. I let the door click shut behind me. The lock engaged with a sharp metal snap. Naomi jumped a foot in the air. She spun around, her hand flying to her chest. "Mrs. Crowe!" she gasped. "Jesus, you scared me." "Language, Naomi," I said automatically. I walked over to the row of sinks and placed my purse on the counter. I didn't look at her. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. "You don't look well. Is the guilt giving you indigestion?" Naomi's face went pale beneath her heavy foundation. I don't know what you mean. It's a lot. Seeing everyone." "It must be," I said, turning to face her. "Especially seeing Conrad. Does he know you're drinking this much?" He usually prefers his loose ends to be sober and silent. Naomi took a step back, hitting the paper towel dispenser. "I have to go." I stepped sideways, blocking the path to the door. I am not a physically imposing woman, but I have 40 years of authority in my posture. You aren't going anywhere. I just came from Shady Pines, Naomi. I spoke to Thomas Miller. Her eyes widened. The wine glass in her hand trembled, splashing Chardonnay onto the floor. Thomas? Is he still alive? Barely, I said, but his memory is excellent. He remembers the call you made on May 12, 1992. He remembers you crying. He remembers you saying you were hiking at the quarry. Naomi shook her head frantically. No, that wasn't me. You have the wrong person. Do not lie to me, Naomi Kessler, I snapped. My voice echoed off the tile walls. I tolerated your lies about homework assignments in 1990, but I will not tolerate lies about a murder. You saw them. Naomi crumbled. It wasn't a slow slide, it was a collapse. She sank down onto the cold tile floor, her red dress billowing around her like a pool of blood. She put her face in her hands and began to sob. It was the ugly, raw crying of a woman who has been holding her breath for 3 decades. He promised, she choked out. He promised it was an accident. I pulled my phone from my purse. I opened the voice memo app and pressed the red record button. I crouched down, ignoring the pain in my hip. Tell me, I commanded softly. Tell me exactly what you saw. Naomi looked up, mascara running down her cheeks. I was skipping class. I went to the ridge to smoke. I saw his car. The blue Mustang. Conrad and Sarah were down by the water. They were screaming at each other. About what? The baby, Naomi whispered. She told him she was keeping it. She said she was going to tell his father. Conrad, he just snapped. He didn't hit her, Mrs. Crowe. He shoved her, but she fell back. She hit her head on the rocks. The sound. She shuddered. It was like a melon cracking. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest. And then what happened? He checked her pulse, Naomi said. Then he just stood there. He looked up at the ridge. I ducked down. I was so scared. I ran back to my car. I called the station from a payphone. I told the deputy, but then Deputy Pyle called me back at home that night. Conrad's father, I said. He told me I was mistaken, she sobbed. He said if I spread rumors about his son, he'd plant drugs in my locker. He said he'd ruin my life. I was 17, Mrs. Crowe. I was just a kid. You were a kid then, I said sternly. You are an adult now, and you have let a killer run this town for 30 years. I stopped the recording. I had it. The confession, the motive, the cover-up. Get up, Naomi, I said. Fix your face. We are going to the state police. Tonight. Naomi looked at me with terrified eyes. He's out there, Conrad. If he sees us leaving together, let him see, I said. I am done hiding. I stood up and offered her a hand. She took it, her palm clammy and cold. I pulled her to her feet. Suddenly, the bathroom door rattled. Someone was trying to get in. I had locked it, but the handle jiggled violently. Then, a heavy pounding started. Occupied, I shouted. Mrs. Crowe? It was Conrad's voice, smooth, deep, and right outside the wood. Open up. We need to have a word. Naomi doesn't look well. Naomi froze. She looked at the door like it was a monster's mouth. He knows, she whispered. He saw us come in. I looked at the bathroom window. It was high up, small and frosted glass. Too small for a person. We were trapped.
Pull yourself together, I hissed at Naomi. Do not say a word. Let me do the talking. I unlocked the door and swung it open. Conrad Pyle was standing there. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was flanked by 2 men in dark suits. His security detail, which was a polite word for hired muscle. Conrad, I said, blocking the doorway. This is the ladies' room. I believe you are in the wrong precinct. Conrad looked over my shoulder at Naomi, who was shivering by the sinks. I'm just checking on my old friends, Conrad said. His eyes were flat and hard. Naomi looks upset. I think she needs a ride home. My boys here can take her. That won't be necessary, I said, clutching my phone tight in my hand. Naomi is riding with me. Conrad stepped forward, invading my personal space. He loomed over me, smelling of whiskey and aggression. I insist, he said softly. Naomi has a history of confusion. We wouldn't want her saying things she doesn't mean. Driving under the influence of hysteria is dangerous, Sylvia. He reached out and grabbed Naomi's arm. She yelped. Let her go, I said. Or what? Conrad sneered. You'll give me detention? He pulled Naomi past me. She was too weak to fight. She looked at me with pleading eyes, but she let him lead her away. I'll take care of her, Conrad said to me. You should go home, Mrs. Crowe, before you fall and break a hip. He turned and walked away, his men flanking Naomi like prison guards. They were taking her out the back exit. I stood alone in the hallway. I had the recording on my phone, but he had the witness. I looked at the screen of my phone. Voice memo 1. I needed to get this to the sheriff. No, not the sheriff. The state police. But the nearest post was 40 miles away. I started to run, a fast, hobbling walk, toward the front door. I had to get to my car. I had to get out of range before he realized I had recorded everything. I burst out of the VFW hall into the humid night air. I fumbled for my keys. I reached my Buick. I pressed the unlock button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Silence. I looked down at my tires. All 4 of them were slashed. The rubber was flat against the asphalt. I looked up. The black sedan was parked at the exit of the lot, engine idling, blocking the only way out. Conrad wasn't just taking the witness, he was trapping the prosecutor. I stood in the humid darkness of the parking lot and looked at my Buick. It sat low and heavy on the asphalt, a wounded beast that wasn't going anywhere. The slash marks on the tires were clean and deliberate, a single vertical cut on each sidewall. This wasn't the work of a drunk teenager with a pocket knife. It was the work of a professional who knew exactly where to strike to disable a vehicle without making a sound. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but my mind was cold. I gripped my phone so hard, my knuckles turned white. Inside that small metal rectangle was the voice of Naomi Kessler confessing to a 30-year-old crime. It was the smoking gun, and right now, I was a sitting duck holding it. I looked toward the exit. The black sedan was still there, idling. The exhaust fumes drifted through the red glow of the taillights like bloody mist. They were waiting. They didn't need to attack me here in the open. They just needed to keep me pinned until they could figure out how to take what I had. I couldn't stay by the car. It was a coffin. I turned back toward the VFW hall. The music was still thumping, a bass drum that vibrated in the soles of my shoes. If I could get back inside, into the crowd, I would be safe for a moment. I could borrow a phone. I could call the state police in Atlanta. I took a step toward the building, but a wash of blue light suddenly flooded the parking lot. A sheriff's cruiser swung in from the side entrance, its lights flashing silently. No siren.
just the blinding strobe of blue and white cutting through the night. For a split second, I felt a surge of relief. The police, but then I remembered the name on the side of the car. Pyle. The family name was painted on every badge and every patrol car in this county. The cruiser pulled up slowly and parked at an angle, blocking my path back to the hall. The door opened and a boot hit the gravel. It was Deputy Hicks. I knew him. He had been a mediocre student who sat in the back of my geography class and drew pictures of guns in the margins of his textbook. He was 40 now, with a thickening waist and a face that looked like dough that hadn't risen properly. "Evening, Mrs. Crowe," he said, hitching up his belt. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hands, specifically at my phone. "Deputy Hicks," I said, keeping my voice level. "I seem to have been the victim of a crime. My tires have been slashed." Hicks walked over to the Buick. He kicked the flat rubber of the rear tire lightly. "Well now, that is a shame. We've had reports of some kids causing trouble in the area tonight. Vandalism." "It wasn't kids," I said, "and you know it." Hicks turned to me. He adjusted his hat. The blue lights washed over his face, making his eyes look like empty sockets. "Now, Mrs. Crowe, let's not start making accusations. You're upset. It's late. Why don't you hand me that phone?" I took a step back. "Why would I do that?" "Evidence," Hicks said, extending a hand. His palm was fleshy and damp. "If you saw the vandals, or if you took any photos of the scene, we need to process it. Standard procedure. I need to take the device into custody to download the data." "I did not take photos of the vandals," I said. "And there is private information on this phone. I am not handing it over without a warrant." Hicks took a step forward. He was invading my space, using his size to intimidate. It was the same tactic Conrad had used in the hallway. They were all just bullies who had grown into bigger bodies. "Mrs. Crowe," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "I am investigating a felony vandalism case. You are a witness. If you refuse to cooperate with an investigation, I can arrest you for obstruction of justice. And at your age, a night in the county lockup might be difficult on your health." The threat was clear. Give up the phone or go to jail. And if I went to jail, the phone would be confiscated anyway during processing. I looked down at the screen. I had one bar of service. The metal roof of the VFW hall was blocking the signal. "I need to make a call first," I said. "I need to call a tow truck." "I've already called one for you," Hicks said. He was moving closer. "Give me the phone, Sylvia." He used my first name. The disrespect stung almost as much as the fear. I had to try. I quickly tapped the screen, trying to open my email app. If I could attach the voice memo and hit send. Hicks saw what I was doing. He didn't shout. He just moved. He lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. His grip was painful, twisting my arm behind my back. "Hey!" I shouted. "Get your hands off me!" "Stop resisting!" Hicks yelled, loud enough for any onlookers to hear. "I am securing evidence!" He wrenched my fingers apart. My phone fell from my hand and hit the asphalt with a sickening crack. Hicks released my arm and scooped up the phone. He turned it over. The screen was spiderwebbed with cracks, but it was still glowing. He smiled. It was a small, tight smile of satisfaction. "Clumsy," he said. "We'll have to put that in the report. Dropped during a struggle." He slipped my phone into his breast pocket. He patted it like he was securing a pack of cigarettes. "Now," he said, dusting off his hands, "you're free to go, Mrs. Crowe. Since your car is disabled, I'd offer you a ride. But I have to get this evidence back to the station immediately. I'm sure one of your friends inside can take you home." He turned and walked back to his cruiser. I stood there, rubbing my bruising wrist, watching him go. I had lost. I had the truth in my hand, and he had taken it. He would drive 3 miles down the road, pull over, and delete that file. Or maybe he would just crush the phone under his boot and throw it in the river. Either way, Naomi's confession was gone. And Naomi herself was gone, taken away by Conrad. The cruiser backed up, the gravel crunching under its tires. Hicks gave me a little 2-finger salute through the window, and then he sped off, following the black sedan out of the lot. I was alone. The anger that rose up in me then was not the hot, fiery anger of the rose garden. This was something colder. This was the ice-cold fury of a teacher who realizes the system is broken, and the only way to fix it is to burn the lesson plan and start over. They thought they had won. They thought that by taking the digital proof, they had erased the past. But they forgot one thing. Digital files can be deleted, phones can be smashed, but ink on paper lasts forever. I remembered the police report I had seen in the basement, the one with the handwritten note about the witness. That note mentioned a blue Ford Mustang, but there was something else I had seen in the archives years ago, something I hadn't thought about until this exact moment. Sarah Miller was a writer. She wrote for the school newspaper. She wrote poetry. She wrote everything down. If she was pregnant, if she was scared, if she was planning to run away or confront Conrad, she wouldn't just tell people. She would have written it down. And girls like Sarah Miller didn't type their secrets. They wrote them in diaries. I looked back at the VFW hall. I didn't need a ride from a friend. I needed a ride to the other side of town. I saw a beat-up pickup truck pulling out of a spot near the back. I recognized the driver. It was Billy Ray, a boy I had failed in history twice because he refused to read the textbook, but who could fix any engine with a wrench and a piece of chewing gum. I waved my arms. Billy slowed down and rolled down the window. "Mrs. Crowe?" he asked, looking confused. "You okay?" "Billy," I said, walking up to the truck. "I need a ride, and I need you to not ask any questions." Billy looked at my slashed tires. He looked at the bruise forming on my wrist. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pavement. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Hop in." I climbed into the cab of the truck. It smelled of motor oil and stale cigarettes. "Where to?" Billy asked. "The old Miller place," I said. "Sarah Miller's mother is still alive. She's in a nursing home now, but the house has been sitting empty for years." "That place is full of junk, Mrs. Crowe," Billy said, shifting the truck into gear. "Hoarders live there." "I know," I said, staring out the windshield as we pulled onto the main road. "That's exactly why we are going, because people who hoard things never throw anything away." Conrad Pyle had deleted the digital copy, but he couldn't delete a book he didn't know existed. I was going to find that diary. And this time, I wasn't going to bring it to the police. I was going to bring it to the people. "Drive fast, Billy," I said. Billy grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The pickup truck rattled over the potholes of County Road 9 like a tin can full of marbles. The suspension was shot, and every bump sent a jolt of pain through my bad hip, but I sat rigid in the passenger seat, clutching the dashboard. Billy Ray drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting on the gear shift, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. He didn't ask me why the police had taken my phone or why the mayor's security detail looked like hired thugs. In this part of Georgia, people learn early that asking the wrong questions can shorten your life expectancy. We turned off the paved road onto a gravel driveway that was almost swallowed by kudzu. The vines hung from the trees like green ghosts draping over the power lines and choking out the moonlight. At the end of the drive sat the Miller house. It was a rotting Victorian structure that had once been painted white but was now the color of a bruise. The porch sagged dangerously to the left, and the windows were dark eyes staring back at us. Sarah Miller's mother had been a difficult woman even before her daughter disappeared. After Sarah vanished, Mrs. Miller had retreated into the house and stopped throwing things away. She filled the empty space in her heart with newspapers and margarine tubs and broken furniture until the county finally hauled her off to the nursing home 3 years ago. Billy killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy and thick with the sound of cicadas. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Crowe?" Billy asked, keeping his voice low. "This place gives me the creeps. My cousin said he saw a light in the window last Halloween." "Ghosts don't scare me, Billy," I said, opening the door. "It is the living you have to watch out for." I stepped down into the tall grass. The air smelled of wet earth and mildew. I walked up the steps, testing each board with the toe of my shoe before putting my weight on it. The front door was locked, but the wood around the frame was soft with rot. Billy walked up behind me. He pulled a crowbar from his belt loop. I didn't ask why he carried a crowbar to a class reunion. I simply stepped aside. He wedged the metal into the jamb and gave a sharp tug. The wood splintered with a wet crunch, and the door swung open. The smell hit us immediately. It was a physical wall of stench, dust, and cat urine, and the sweet, sickly odor of decaying paper. Billy pulled his shirt up over his nose, but I forced myself to breathe shallowly. I had smelled worse things in the boys' locker room after a double overtime game. We stepped inside and clicked on our flashlights. The beams cut through the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. The hallway was a tunnel of debris. Stacks of National Geographic magazines formed waist-high walls on either side. Garbage bags filled with clothes were piled to the ceiling. It was a labyrinth of junk, a monument to a mind that couldn't let go. "Watch your step," I whispered. We navigated through the living room where a family of possums had clearly made a nest in the sofa. I was looking for the stairs. Sarah's room had been on the second floor facing the east so she could see the sunrise. The stairs were treacherous. Piles of books were stacked on every tread, leaving only a narrow path close to the banister. We climbed slowly, single file. When we reached the landing, I turned left. The door to Sarah's room was closed. A piece of paper was taped to the wood. It was a yellowed page from a notebook with the words "Keep Out" written in thick black marker. I felt a pang of sadness so sharp it nearly winded me. I remembered Sarah writing that sign. She had told me about it in homeroom, laughing about how her mother kept trying to come in and rearrange her closet. I turned the knob. It wasn't locked. The room was exactly as she had left it in 992. It was a time capsule, but unlike the one in the town square, this one hadn't been sanitized by the mayor. The bed was unmade, the sheets dusty and gray. Posters of bands I didn't recognize were peeling off the walls. A pile of clothes sat on the chair, as if she had just taken them off to hop into the shower. But the clutter here was different. It wasn't trash. It was the chaos of a teenage girl. Billy stood in the doorway, shining his light around the room. "It feels like she just stepped out," he whispered. "Start looking, Billy," I said, moving toward the desk. "We are looking for a book, a diary, maybe a spiral notebook or a leather journal." We began to search. I opened the desk drawers. They were full of dried-up pens and erasers and notes folded into triangles. I unfolded a few. They were mundane gossip about boys and tests and who was mad at whom. Nothing about Conrad, nothing about a baby. I checked under the mattress, nothing but dust bunnies. I checked the closet, shoeboxes full of letters but mostly from pen pals in other states. Minutes ticked by. The heat in the house was stifling. Sweat trickled down my back. I began to feel a rising panic. What if she didn't write it down? What if I was wrong? What if Sarah Miller took her secrets to the grave because she was too afraid to put them on paper? I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. I looked around the room, trying to think like her. Sarah was smart. She was in my honors history class. She sat in the front row. She was quiet, but she was observant. She knew that her mother was a snoop. She wouldn't hide a diary in a drawer or under a mattress. Those are the first places a mother looks. I closed my eyes and pictured her in my classroom. She always had a stack of books on her desk. She loved literature, To Kill a Mockingbird, The Great Gatsby, Wuthering Heights. I opened my eyes and looked at the bookshelf in the corner. It was overflowing with paperbacks. If you want to hide a tree, you hide it in a forest. If you want to hide a book, you hide it among other books. I stood up and walked to the shelf. I ran my finger along the spines. The Catcher in the Rye, The Outsiders, Lord of the Flies. And then I stopped. On the bottom shelf, tucked between two thick anthologies of poetry, was a hardcover book that didn't belong. It was a copy of The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. I frowned. That was a textbook I used in my AP European history class. Sarah wasn't in that class, and even if she was, that book was massive and incredibly dense. Sarah liked fiction. She liked stories about feelings, not dry treatises on political economics. I pulled the book off the shelf. It was heavy. I opened the cover. The pages had been glued together. The center of the book had been hollowed out with a razor blade, creating a secret compartment. Sitting inside the hollowed-out space was a small red velvet journal. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The oldest trick in the book, quite literally. I pulled the journal out. My hands were shaking again. I opened it to the last entry, May 11th, 1992. The handwriting was small and cramped fast and frantic. I told him. I met him at the quarry after school. I showed him the test. He turned so white, I thought he was going to faint. Then he got angry. Not yelling angry, but quiet angry, which is worse. He said it would ruin his father's election. He said I was trying to trap him. He told me to meet him tomorrow at the ridge. He said he has a plan. He said he has money and we can go away together to Atlanta to take care of it. I don't want to go. I'm scared. But what choice do I have? My mom would kill me. If I don't come home tomorrow, it's because I went with him. I pray he loves me. I pray I'm not making a mistake. I read the words twice. He said he has a plan to take care of it. Conrad didn't take her to Atlanta. He took her to the ridge, and he ended the problem the way politicians always end problems, by removing the obstacle. I looked up at Billy. He was watching me, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "Did you find it?" he asked. I nodded. I have it. I closed the journal and slipped it into the waistband of my skirt, covering it with my cardigan. "We need to go, Billy. Right now." We turned to leave. But as we stepped out into the hallway, a sound stopped us dead in our tracks. It was the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside. Then a car door slammed. Then another. I rushed to the window in Sarah's room and peered through the dirty glass. Down in the driveway blocking Billy's truck was the black sedan, and behind it was Deputy Hicks's cruiser. They hadn't followed us. They had anticipated us. Conrad knew I was a historian. He knew I would look for the past. "We're trapped," Billy whispered, gripping his crowbar. "No," I said, my mind racing. "We are not trapped. We are on home turf." I looked at the piles of hoarders' junk filling the hallway. The stacks of newspapers, the bags of old clothes. This house wasn't a trap. It was a weapon. "Billy," I said, turning to him. "Do you have a lighter?" Billy reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered Zippo. "Always Mrs. Crowe." I pointed to the stack of newspapers at the top of the stairs. "Light it," I said. Billy's eyes went wide. "You want me to burn the house down?" "I want you to create a diversion," I said. "Fire scares people. It makes them panic. It makes them retreat." We could hear heavy footsteps on the front porch. The front door creaked open. Mrs. Crowe Conrad's voice floated up the stairs. Come out wherever you are. Class isn't over yet." "Light it, Billy," I commanded. Billy flicked the lighter. The flame danced in the dark. He touched it to the edge of a stack of Atlanta Constitutions from 1989. The paper was dry as bone. It caught instantly. The fire whooshed up orange and hungry licking at the banister. "Go!" I shouted, pointing to the back window. "The roof of the porch is right there." We climbed down the trellis. As the smoke began to fill the hallway, choking out the smell of rot, I climbed out the window, clutching the diary against my chest. I was 74 years old, and I was climbing, down a trellis while a house burned behind me. I hoped Conrad Pyle liked the heat, because he was about to get burned. Fire is a living thing. It breathes, it eats, and when it is fed a diet of 30-year-old newspapers and dry rot, it grows with a terrifying speed. The hallway inside the Miller house was already an inferno, a wall of orange heat that roared like a jet engine. I was halfway out the window, one leg over the sill, when I heard the shouting from below. "Fire! Get back!" That was Hicks. "Do not let them leave." That was Conrad. His voice cracked with panic. He knew that if I was burning the house, I wasn't doing it to destroy evidence. I was doing it to escape with it. "Jump, Mrs. Crowe!" Billy hissed from the ground. He had already dropped down from the porch roof and was standing in the tall grass, arms reaching up. I swung my other leg over. The drop was only 6 feet, but with a titanium hip, it might as well have been 60. I clutched the red diary to my chest, whispered a prayer to whatever saint watches over foolish old women, and let go. I landed hard. The shockwave traveled up my spine, knocking the wind out of me. Pain flared in my hip, sharp and white-hot, but Billy was there instantly. He grabbed me under the arms and hauled me up. "Can you run?" he asked. "I can walk fast," I gasped. "Go!" We scrambled through the overgrown yard, away from the driveway where the police cruiser and the black sedan were parked. We couldn't go that way. We would be seen instantly. "The truck," Billy whispered. "It's blocked in." "Go through the fence," I ordered, pointing to the side yard where the wooden slats were sagging under the weight of honeysuckle vines. "It's a pickup, Billy. Make it work." We reached the truck. Billy threw open the passenger door and shoved me inside. He vaulted into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life, a loud, coughing sputter that sounded like a gunshot in the night. Through the windshield, I saw movement near the front of the house. Hicks and Conrad were stumbling out the front door, coughing, their silhouettes framed by the glow of the burning foyer. Conrad pointed at us. "Stop them!" he screamed. Billy didn't hesitate. He slammed the truck into gear and floored it. We didn't aim for the driveway. We aimed for the side fence. The truck bucked and bounced over hidden roots and mounds of trash. We hit the fence at 30 miles an hour. The wood shattered like matchsticks, and we burst through into the neighboring field. Billy fought the wheel as the back tires spun in the soft mud, throwing up a rooster tail of dirt. Then, the tires caught traction, and we shot forward, bouncing toward the county road. I looked back. The Miller house was now a torch. Flames were licking out of the second-story windows, illuminating the 2 men standing helplessly in the yard. They had to move their own cars or risk them exploding.
They couldn't chase us yet.
"Where to?"
Billy yelled over the roar of the engine. "Not my house," I said, clutching the diary. "And not the police station. We need somewhere with a scanner and an internet connection. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look immediately." "The library is closed," Billy said. "Elias Thorne," I said. "He lives on Cedar Street, the little cottage with the blue shutters. Go." Billy navigated the back roads, keeping the headlights off until we were miles away from the smoke rising into the night sky. My heart was slowly returning to a normal rhythm, but my mind was racing ahead. We had the physical proof, but physical proof is fragile. It can be burned, stolen, or lost. I needed to make it immortal. We pulled up to Elias's house 10 minutes later. It was dark, but a faint light glowed in the back window. I knew Elias was an insomniac. He spent his nights reading the books he spent his days organizing. I banged on the door. "Elias, it's Sylvia!" The porch light flicked on. The door opened a crack, the chain still engaged. Elias peered out, wearing a plaid robe and looking terrified. "Sylvia?" he whispered. I heard sirens. I saw smoke toward the old Miller place. "Open the door, Elias," I said. "We don't have time." He undid the chain and ushered us in. The cottage was small, neat, and smelled of tea and old paper. A mirror image of my own home, but safer. "What happened?" Elias asked, looking at Billy's soot-streaked face and my ruined stockings. "I found it," I said, pulling the red journal from my cardigan. "Sarah's diary. It proves everything. But Conrad knows I have it. He's coming." Elias's eyes widened behind his thick glasses. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He simply turned and walked to his desk in the corner, where a high-end flatbed scanner sat next to his computer. "Give it to me," he said. We worked in silence. Elias opened the journal, pressing the spine flat against the glass. The light of the scanner hummed, a rhythmic whir-click that sounded like a heartbeat. Page by page, Sarah Miller's voice was converted from fading ink into digital code. We scanned the entry about the pregnancy. We scanned the entry about the meeting at the quarry. We scanned the final entry where she wrote, "He said he has a plan." "Upload it to the cloud," I commanded. 3 different servers. And email a copy to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the FBI field office. Elias's fingers flew across the keyboard. Done, and sending now." A progress bar appeared on the screen. Sending, 45%, 60%. "They can't stop it now," Billy said, watching the screen. "It's in the air." "No," I said, staring at the screen. "The police and the papers take time. They investigate. They verify. By the time they move, Conrad could be halfway to a non-extradition country. Or he could spin a story about how I forged the diary. He's a politician. He can survive a scandal if he controls the narrative." "So, what do we do?" Elias asked. The screen flashed sent. I looked at the 3 men, Billy, the mechanic, Elias, the librarian, and Thomas, the memory in the nursing home, and me, the teacher. We were the people this town ignored. "We don't wait for the authorities," I said. "We take the class to him." "The town hall meeting," Elias said, catching on. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock a.m. It's being televised live on the local access channel." "Exactly," I said. "Conrad thinks he's going there to accept his re-election nomination. He thinks he's going to talk about the future." I picked up the red journal. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than paper should be. "I am going to stand up at that podium," I said, "and I am going to read this diary to the entire town. I want them to hear Sarah's words.
I want them to look at his face when I read the part about the baby. He won't let you in, Billy said. He'll have security everywhere. He will be looking for a woman with a car, I said. He won't be looking for a woman with an army. I turned to Elias. Do you still have the contact list for the teachers' union? The retired list? Elias nodded. Of course. And Billy, I said, do you still talk to the boys from the auto shop? The ones who hate that the mayor raised the business tax? Billy grinned, his teeth white in his soot-covered face. Yes, ma'am. We got a group chat. Good, I said. Call them. Call everyone. Tell them Mrs. Crowe is calling an emergency assembly. Attendance is mandatory. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2 a.m. We have 8 hours to organize, I said. Let's get to work. The town hall auditorium was packed to the rafters. It was a space designed to intimidate, with high vaulted ceilings, heavy velvet drapes, and a raised stage that placed the politicians 6 feet above the people they served. The air conditioner was fighting a losing battle against the heat of 300 bodies and the glare of the television lights set up by the local news crew. I stood in the vestibule just outside the double oak doors. I was wearing a fresh suit, borrowed from Elias's sister. That was a size too big, but I had pinned it to fit. I held the red diary in my hands like a hymnal. Behind me stood my army. It wasn't a mob. It was something far more dangerous to a man like Conrad Pyle. It was a faculty meeting. To my left was Billy Ray and 20 burly mechanics from the auto shop, men with grease under their fingernails and tire irons tucked into their belts. To my right were the retired teachers, a phalanx of women in sensible shoes who had taught this town how to read and write. Behind them were the librarians, the lunch ladies, and the janitors, the invisible people who see everything. Are you ready, Mrs. Crowe? Billy whispered. I smoothed the cover of the diary. I have never been late for a class in my life, Billy. Open the doors. Billy and 2 other men pushed the heavy doors open. They slammed against the back walls with a sound like a thunderclap. Inside the auditorium, the noise died instantly. On stage, Conrad Pyle froze mid-sentence. He was standing at the podium, flanked by the American flag and the Georgia state flag, looking every inch the statesman. He had been talking about family values and trust. When he saw me, the color drained from his face so fast, it looked like a curtain falling. He gripped the sides of the podium until his knuckles turned white. I began to walk down the center aisle. I did not hurry. I walked with the slow, rhythmic cadence of a proctor patrolling an exam room. My cane tapped against the hardwood floor. Click. Step. Click. Step. Behind me, my army flowed into the room. They filled the back of the auditorium. They lined the walls. They were silent, grim, and utterly unmovable. Security! Conrad barked into the microphone, his voice shrill and cracked, betraying his fear to the entire room. Remove these people! They are disrupting a municipal proceeding. 2 uniformed officers near the stage stepped forward. One of them was Deputy Hicks. He put his hand on his holster and started toward me. Stop right there! Hicks shouted. I didn't stop, but Billy Ray did. He stepped in front of me, crossing his massive arms over his chest. 3 other mechanics stepped up beside him, forming a wall of denim and muscle. Get out of the way, Billy, Hicks warned. Mrs. Crowe has the floor, Billy said calmly. And you know the rules, Hicks. You don't interrupt the teacher. Hicks hesitated. He looked at the mechanics, then he looked at the cameras which were now swiveling to point directly at us. He knew that if he drew his weapon on live television against a group of unarmed locals and an old woman, his career was over. Let her speak! A voice shouted from the balcony. It was Mrs. Gable, the retired choir director. Let her speak! Another voice joined in. Conrad looked around frantically. "Cut the feed," he yelled at the camera crew. "Cut the damn feed." The cameraman, a boy named Jason who had once written a very moving poem about his grandmother for my English class, looked at the mayor. Then he looked at me. He didn't cut the feed. He zoomed in. I reached the front of the room. I didn't go up the stairs to the stage. I didn't need to be on his level. I stood in the well, looking up at him. "Conrad Pyle," I said. My voice wasn't amplified, but 30 years of projecting to the back of a classroom meant that every person in that room heard me. "You have been grading your own papers for too long." "You are senile," Conrad spat, leaning over the podium. "You are a confused old woman who is grieving her roses. Go home, Sylvia." I held up the red diary. The velvet cover caught the light. "Do you recognize this, Conrad?" I asked. He flinched. He recognized it. I saw the recognition in the way his eyes widened and his jaw went slack. "This is the diary of Sarah Miller," I announced to the room. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "The girl you said ran away to Hollywood. The girl whose jacket you claimed to have buried in the time capsule." "That's a forgery!" Conrad screamed. "She wrote that herself. It's a lie." "I haven't read it yet," I said calmly. "How do you know what it says if you haven't read it? Unless, of course, you were there when she wrote the final entry." The room went deadly silent. I opened the book. The spine cracked. "May 11th, 1992, I read aloud. "I told him. I met him at the quarry. I showed him the test." I looked up at Conrad. He was shaking his head, sweat pouring down his face. "Stop," he whispered. "Stop it." I continued reading. He turned so white, I thought he was going to faint. He said it would ruin his father's election. He said I was trying to trap him. I turned the page. "He told me to meet him tomorrow at the ridge. He said he has a plan to take care of it. I pray he loves me. I pray I'm not making a mistake." I closed the book. The sound echoed like a gavel strike. I looked at the audience. I looked at the mothers clutching their purses, at the fathers holding their hats. "Sarah Miller didn't run away," I said. "She was pregnant. She was scared. And she went to meet the father of her child at the ridge. She never came home. And the next day, this man," I pointed a shaking finger at Conrad, "forged a doctor's note to explain why he wasn't at school. He forged his own father's signature, and then his father buried the investigation just like Conrad buried her jacket." "Lies!" Conrad shrieked. He looked unhinged now. "She's lying! Arrest her!" "We have the police report." Elias Thorne's voice rang out from the back. He held up a sheaf of papers. "We have the original dispatch log from the basement archives. It shows Deputy Pyle covered up a witness sighting." "And we have the witness," I added. The side door opened. It wasn't Naomi Kessler. Conrad had taken her. But it was someone else. It was Thomas Miller. His nephew wheeled him into the auditorium. The old deputy looked frail, but he was sitting up straight. He held a microphone in his trembling hand. "I took the call," Thomas rasped. His voice was amplified over the speakers. "May 12th. Naomi Kessler called. She saw them. She saw Conrad push her." Conrad stumbled back from the podium. He looked for an exit, but the stage wings were blocked by the janitors. He looked at the crowd, but the adoration was gone. In its place was a collective, horrifying realization. He wasn't the mayor anymore. He was the monster who had killed the town's sweetheart. "You failed, Conrad," I said softly. "You failed the test of character, and in my class, there are no makeups for murder." From the back of the room, the heavy doors opened again.
This time, it wasn't teachers or mechanics. It was the Georgia State Police. 4 troopers in gray uniforms marched down the aisle, their hats low over their eyes. They weren't looking at me. They were looking at the stage. Conrad Pyle sank to his knees. He covered his face with his hands. I turned to the camera. I looked directly into the lens, into the living rooms of everyone who had voted for him, everyone who had looked the other way for 30 years. "Class is dismissed," I said. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut is a very specific mechanical noise. It is sharper than a car door closing and heavier than a padlock snapping. It is the sound of finality. I watched from the floor of the auditorium as the state troopers pulled Conrad Pyle to his feet. He didn't fight. The arrogance that had sustained him for 30 years had evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, sweating man who looked small in his expensive suit. He looked at me as they led him away, his eyes pleading for some kind of leniency, some kind of extra credit assignment that could fix his grade. I didn't look away. I held his gaze until they pushed him through the side doors. The room remained silent for a long time. It was the silence of a congregation that realizes they have been worshiping a false idol. Then, slowly, the murmuring began. People looked at each other with shame in their eyes. They looked at the diary in my hand. They looked at Thomas Miller in his wheelchair. They realized that the monster wasn't just Conrad. The monster was their own blindness. The days that followed were a blur of activity that this sleepy town had never seen before. The FBI arrived. The news vans from Atlanta and Charlotte camped out on the town square. Their satellite dishes pointed like accusing fingers at City Hall. They found Naomi Kessler in a hunting cabin owned by the Pyle family 3 miles out of town. She was shaken and dehydrated, but alive. When the federal agents brought her out, she didn't hide her face from the cameras. She looked straight into the lens and told her story again. She testified that she had been threatened, silenced, and terrified. Her testimony was the nail in Conrad's coffin, but it was also her own liberation. 2 days after the arrest, the excavation team went to the ridge above the quarry. I went with them. I stood by the yellow police tape as the forensic anthropologists sifted through the dirt. It took them 6 hours. When they finally found her, she wasn't buried deep. She was tucked into a crevice between 2 boulders, covered with rocks and 30 years of forest debris. They brought her up in a body bag. It was small, too small. I watched them carry her past. I didn't cry. Teachers don't cry when the work is done. We only cry when we fail. And I hadn't failed her. It took me 3 decades, but I had finally marked her present. Conrad Pyle was denied bail. The charges were a laundry list that would keep him in prison until the sun burned out. 2nd-degree murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and arson. His lawyers tried to argue that the diary was hearsay, but the DNA evidence from the ridge and the confession from Naomi were insurmountable. The golden boy was going to rust in a cell. Life in the town began to change. The Pyle family name, once a license to do whatever they pleased, became a stain. The sheriff, Conrad's cousin, resigned in disgrace before the governor could remove him. As for me, I went back to Elm Street. My house was still standing, though it smelled faintly of smoke from my clothes. My rose garden was still a wreck of mud and broken stems. A week after the funeral, a proper service for Sarah, attended by hundreds of people who finally felt safe enough to mourn her. I was out in the yard. I was on my knees, trowel in hand, digging up the ruined roots of my grandifloras. "Need some help with that, Mrs. Crowe?" I looked up. Billy Ray was standing there. He was holding a shovel and a flat of new rose bushes.
But he wasn't alone. Behind him was Jason, the cameraman, and Mary Beth from the reunion, and Elias Thorne. Even the young girl from the mayor's reception desk was there, wearing gardening gloves.
"We thought,"
Billy stammered, rubbing the back of his neck.
"We thought maybe we could help you replant, since, we let the weeds grow for too long."
He wasn't talking about the garden. I looked at them. They were my former students. They were the people who had looked away for 30 years, but who had finally stood up when it mattered. I wiped my dirty hands on my apron and smiled. "Well," I said, pointing to the empty bed, "don't just stand there. The soil isn't going to turn itself. And Billy, if you plant those too deep, I will fail you again." Billy laughed. It was a good, clean sound. We worked until the sun went down. We planted white roses this time. Peace, purity, new beginnings. That evening, I sat on my porch with a glass of iced tea. The air was cooling down. The town was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the silence of secrets kept. It was the silence of peace. I opened my notebook, the new one I had bought. I turned to the page marked Conrad Pyle. I took my red pen and drew a single, thick line through his name. Expelled. I closed the book and set it on the table. The history of this town had been rewritten, corrected in red ink. The lesson was over. But a teacher's work is never truly done. There are always new students, new lessons, and new secrets buried in the dark. And as long as I have my gradebook, I'll be watching. So that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that justice delayed is still justice? Or does a town share the guilt when they stay silent for 30 years? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.